Hi there, my name is David Brayley and I'm an author, and I'm going to talk to you today for Neath and Port Talbot Libraries about ways you might consider starting your story. Now, it's one of the toughest things to do actually. You might have a fantastic idea for a story, you might have written a brilliant plan, you might have developed some excellent characters and everything is coming together. But often beginning that story is the key to the success of the book. Now, if you think about it, you might have written a book that could ultimately rival, I don't know, Harry Potter. You might be convinced that this book is going to sell millions and millions and is going to be the most successful children's book of all time. But if you can't start that story well, if you can't engage with the reader, then the real danger is that the reader might abandon your story before they've even got into it. And that's why it's so important that you get the start to your story correct. It's vital that you use the start of your story to really hook the reader in. As I said, if you don't do that, even if you've written the best story that anyone could ever think of, then quite simply the reader might not read on and they may never get to the best parts of your book. It's also vitally important that it sets the tone for the reader. It sets the tone in a way that the reader starts to bond almost instantly with the characters potentially, if you start with a character, or the setting for the book, or the way the story is going to be told. You really want to get all that right at the start of your story. And it's quite a tricky thing to do because there's no one single correct way to start a story. There are literally dozens and dozens. Now, I've only got 15 minutes or so to talk to you today about this, so I'm not going to go into every potential way that you can start your story. But what I am going to do, I am going to share just about 4 or 5 and a couple that I've chosen in my own books to start stories, just to give you some ideas. Now, the very best way to understand and see the differences in starting any story is to read. I could give you 10 different books by 10 different authors, and every single book would have a different start to the story. None of those are wrong, none of those are bad. They're just the way that that author has chosen to start their story. And the best way for you to get ideas is to read. The more you read, the more you'll be influenced by writers around you, and they will then help shape the way you become a writer and give you ideas on everything, but most importantly on starting your story. Now, I'm going to focus on about 5 different ways, but before I start that, I thought I'd just quickly show you a couple of the books that I've written, and the last 2 really, just to show how different we can start stories. So this is Champion of Champions. It's a book about a young person that sort of dreams of becoming a professional cyclist, and I've used what's called a frame story to start this book. And what that means is that I start the story today, in the actual moment of today. So when the reader reads this book, they are absolutely up to date as at today. And I do a little explanation about why the person is telling this story, in this case a professional cyclist called Daniel. So we actually know that Daniel is a professional cyclist. But Daniel then gets told at the start of the book that if he doesn't do well in a race tomorrow, then he's going to be dropped by the team and he's no longer going to be a professional cyclist. And then the whole of the rest of the book goes back in time. And it goes back in time about 12 or 13 years to when Daniel was just a teenager, long before he became a professional cyclist. And the rest of the book tells us about a circumstance that led to Daniel wanting to become this professional cyclist. And at the end of the book, we bring it right up to the modern day again, and we tell the reader what happened in the race that following day. So that's what we call a frame story. I started the story present day, then I went back in time, and then ended it in the present day as well. The latest book I've written is with rugby legend James Hook. So it's this one called Chasing a Rugby Dream, the first book in a series, and this one is called Kick-Off. And the way that James and I discussed how we wanted to start this story, was different to the way I'd started Champion of Champions. And that sort of goes to prove again, there's no one way of starting a story. And in this book, we decided to start the story with a sort of like a daydreaming sequence. So we meet our first character, or the most important character in the book, Jimmy, and we meet him when he is playing rugby for an international team in a World Cup final. Now, I don't want to spoil it too much in case you've not read the book, but all is not what seems when Jimmy is playing in that World Cup final. And we've used what we call a daydreaming sequence. Jimmy is just off in a world of his own, pretending to be something that he's not. And all of a sudden, the real world hits him and he comes back to his real life. So that's a different way of starting the story compared to what I'd done with Champion of Champions. So there's lots and lots of different ways. And as I said, I'm going to focus on about 5 ways, in addition to the 2 I just shown you, on how you might be able to start your story. Now, what I'm going to do is pretend that I'm starting a story about a young boy called Kyle. Now, Kyle is 11 years of age. Kyle is going to have an adventure, and in the adventure, he is going to look after the safety of his family. If he fails in his adventure, then he won't have looked after the safety of his family, as I mentioned. Now, I've chosen 5 different ways that I could start this story with Kyle. Okay, let's go through them. You could pick the one that you prefer, the one that you might feel interests you most. And maybe after that you've watched this film, you could think of your own start to a story, either in a similar way that I've given you in a moment with these 5, or come up with your own versions. Okay, so let's start with a traditional one where we begin at the beginning. Now, I'm sure it wasn't long ago when you would have been in the early years of primary school that lots of stories begin with once upon a time. Now, we would never really want to use that phrase to start any of our stories as we're now getting a bit more developed with our writing. But the principle really can be the same, starting right at the beginning. So, see what you think of this one. I've got it in front of me and I'll read it to you now. Kyle woke up, rubbed his eyes, threw back the bedclothes, left his bed, walking stiffly to the bedroom window and looked out. Little did he know that what he was about to witness would change his life forever. So that's a really simple, traditional way to start a story. We're meeting our main character, Kyle. We're meeting him at the start of the day, which suggests the start of the story. And we're suggesting that something is going to happen to Kyle in a moment that's going to begin this wonderful adventure that might change his life forever. So that's where we start a traditional story right at the beginning. So let's change it slightly. Let's keep Kyle in our mind. And this time I'm going to start the story just by focusing on Kyle, the character. So we're not going to sort of suggest it's the beginning of an adventure. We're just going to focus on Kyle, the character. And by this, I don't mean that we're going to describe Kyle as being tall with dark hair and wearing a blue t-shirt and with green eyes. We're not going to use that sort of description to start our story. We wouldn't want to go into that detail as the very beginning, because it can be seen as quite a boring start. But we are going to focus on Kyle's character and just see if we can bring something out that might interest the reader to stick with the story. So here we go, starting with Kyle. Kyle looked into the bathroom mirror and focused on the scar that ran across his nose. He touched it. Despite it still being quite tender, it didn't hurt, but the memory of how it came to happen still did. Then he noticed his knuckles and looked at the way the cuts had begun to heal, where all the skin on them had been ripped off. Now again, that is instantly going in to describe something to do with our lead character, Kyle, and it suggests that something's happened to him. And that could be the basis then of explaining what has happened to Kyle. It might well be that the adventure has ended and we're going to tell it going into the past. It might well be that that was just the first day of the adventure and another day is about to start where Kyle has to go into the middle of the adventure again. We can't tell from that introduction. But all we can tell just by simply starting with Kyle as the character, we can tell that something has probably happened to him. Okay, so that's starting with a character. Now, another way to start your story is jumping straight into the action. We're not going to bother with a beginning. We're not going to bother with introducing us to Kyle. We are jumping straight into the heart of the action and exciting the reader right from the first words. So this is maybe how we could start a story about Kyle in that way. Kyle threw himself to the ground, terrified. Gunshots rang out above him. Noises and explosions as big as an earthquake shook him to the core. There was no other option if he was to save everyone. He had to find a way out. And that meant heading straight to the heart of the danger. And from that point then, we would describe and go deeper into the situation that Kyle finds himself, what the danger is, how he's going to approach the danger, and then we launch into our story that way. So this one is starting right in the middle of the action. No background, straight into it. Now, as I said, with the first example, which was the kind of traditional start right at the beginning, we would have built the background up from that point. But here, we are going straight into it. We're making lots of assumptions that hopefully the reader will be excited enough to stick with and find out, well, who is this Kyle? And what is this action? And what is the danger? So again, a different way to start our story. Now, another way. This is where we may want to start the story and instantly make the reader a little bit curious, a little bit interested in what's going on. We want to tantalize the reader and we really want to hook them in to then continue reading our story. So how can we make it curious? Well, we can suggest things. We can start the story by suggesting things that the reader might want to find out. Well, what does that mean? Why did they say that? How is that going to affect the story? So let's go with this one. Kyle wasn't an ordinary schoolboy. I mean, he looked like one. He didn't stand out in a crowd or anything like that. No, he blended right in. But he was different, very different. Kyle possessed a secret that nobody could ever know. He kept the secret for as long as he could remember. And here, on his first day at his latest new school, he knew he had to keep the secret hidden again. The lives of his family depended on it. So again, a totally different beginning to what essentially is going to be the same story involving Kyle. Hopefully, this one has made you think, why is he going to another new school? What is this secret that he's got? Is it a superpower? Is it something that his family's lives are at risk if he tells anyone about the secret? We just don't know. And hopefully, by starting it in this way, making the reader curious, we'll hook the reader in to stick with the rest of your story. And the final way I want to give you a little tip on how you can start the story. And as I said at the start of this, there's so many different ways you can begin your stories. But the final way really is to be quite bold. Start at the end. Start right at the end of the story, and that will allow you then to go all the way back to the beginning. Now, it is quite a dangerous thing to do, I suppose, because if you start in at the end of a story, there's a real danger that you might be giving up the most exciting part right at the beginning. Are you going to keep the reader's interest? This is where your writing needs to be quite clever. So starting at the end, where everything is about to come together, is a very exciting way to begin your stories if you get it right. So let's have a look at this one with Kyle. Kyle looked at the hooded figure who stood menacingly ahead of him, just a couple of meters away. His cold grin chilled Kyle to the bone. It had come to this. Here, in this desperate, desolate wasteland, Kyle's long, painful and dangerous journey was about to come to an end. There was only one thought in Kyle's mind. It would all soon be over. Every second of Kyle's life had led to this point. Not taking his eyes from the enemy for a second, Kyle took a deep breath and took a step forward. There was no going back now. And again, at that point, you could then go back in time, or you could continue with Kyle's next step. What's going to happen? Is he going to take this mysterious stranger on in some form of combat or whatever it might be? But really, we've taken the reader right to the end of the story. And it's up to us as a writer now to still fill in the rest of the story to make it relevant about why Kyle has ended up here. So those are just 5 ways of beginning a story. As I said, I could never tell you one of those 5 is the best. It really depends on what you want to deliver as a writer. And if you're in school, if you're asked to write stories in school, why not try to start your story every time with a different way of beginning it? Now, I've given you 5 today. Why not use those 5 or build on those 5 or develop your own 5? And then the next time you're asked to write a story in school, pick one of those as your idea. Now, don't forget, you're still going to tell the story. So in terms of Kyle's story, there's a journey obviously involved with Kyle. There's some sort of thrill to it where he's looking after the safety of his family. So you've still got to plan that story. You've still got to tell that story, introduce other characters, introduce locations, tie the whole theme of the story, the beginning, the middle and the end, tie it all together. It's just the start of the story that you can play with. Okay? Now I could tell the same story about Kyle and not change a word of that story and start with a different beginning for each one. Okay? So the important thing is you've got the idea for your story. Don't start a story with a brilliant beginning and then have no idea what your story's going to be. You've got to have an idea for the story in the first place. Okay? Then, once you have your idea planned and mapped out, as I said, your characters, the descriptions of the locations where the story is going to take place, the whole idea for the story, that's when you can think, right, what's the best way for me to start this story? How can I really get the reader hooked into what I'm about to talk about? And that is the key to starting a story. Hooking the interest of the reader in so they're going to turn to that next page and carry on the story. And if I could finish now with just one tip, which I've already mentioned at the start of this film, but it is so important. The best way for you to develop your ideas for beginning stories is read. Get yourself into the library at school, get yourself into your local library or down to the bookshop, whatever way and whichever way you get your books, and read different stories by different authors. Read different styles of books. Read things that you know you're going to enjoy. It might be that you love reading about history, so go back and read some historical fiction. It might be that you love reading about sport, which is what I write about, so go and find some books about sport and see how they start their stories. Read about what you love. Take ideas on board, maybe jot a few notes down as you read in the story, but then be influenced by the start of stories that you've enjoyed reading, and then come up with your own versions to make that even better. So thanks very much for watching this. I really, really hope it's been of use to you. And I hope one day to be reading one of your stories and the start will be so good that I just have no option but to turn to that all-important second page and carry on reading through all the way to the end. Good luck with everything, and I hope to see you again someday soon. Thanks very much.